The morning of June 19th, 1944, began like any other in the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea, calm, endless, and deceivingly peaceful. The surface shimmered under the sunlight, but deep below, in the green-black depths, a predator waited in silence. The USS Cavalla, a Balao-class submarine on her first war patrol, drifted slowly at periscope depth. Her engines were quiet, her crew still, her heartbeat mechanical and steady. Inside the steel hull, the air was thick with oil, sweat, and tension. Every man aboard knew what it meant to hunt in enemy waters. One mistake, one noise too loud, and the sea would become their coffin. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, stood over the attack periscope, one hand resting lightly on the handle, his voice calm and low. Around him, the control room glowed in red light, the only sound the faint hum of machinery and the ticking of the chronometer. Above them, far beyond sight, moved the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, a formation so vast that it stretched beyond the horizon. At its center sailed one of Japan's proudest carriers, the Shokaku, the soaring crane, survivor of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, a ship that had carried the Empire's hope and vengeance across the Pacific. Her decks were lined with Zero fighters, her crew confident and unafraid. To them, the American submarine threat was distant, almost laughable. But below, Cavalla's sonar operators were already listening. Faint propeller beats carried through the water, rhythmic and steady, like the footsteps of a giant. The Japanese were near, very near. Kossler leaned closer to the periscope. Through the shimmer of the surface, he glimpsed shadows, ships, columns of them, destroyers first, then cruisers, and finally a vast, flat-topped silhouette cutting through the waves. The Shokaku. The hunter had found his prey. Mark bearings. Kossler ordered quietly. The crew came alive, trained precision, replacing the Kossler stillness. The torpedo data computer whirred softly. Angles, speeds, distances, all calculated in seconds. This was what they had prepared for since the war began. The chance to strike at the heart of the Japanese fleet. The submarine edged closer. Each degree of approach meant greater danger. Above, the destroyers prowled like wolves, their sonar pings echoing faintly through the hull. One wrong move, and they would pounce. At 10:30 a.m., Cavalla slowed to a crawl. Through the periscope lens, Kossler saw the white wakes of aircraft launching from Shokaku's deck. The carrier was alive with motion, a floating city of men and machines, unaware that death moved silently below. He lowered the periscope and whispered, almost to himself, "We've got her." For nearly 2 hours, Cavalla shadowed the Japanese task force, waiting for the perfect angle. Sweat ran down the crew's faces. Men at the torpedo room sat motionless beside their tubes, fingers trembling slightly over the firing levers. Above them, the sun blazed over the blue horizon. Below, in the cold dark, Cavalla held her breath. The ocean between them was measured not in miles, but in heartbeats. The silent hunter had found the soaring crane, and before the day was done, one of them would be gone forever. In the early days of June 1944, as the American invasion of Saipan began, Japan's high command faced a truth too grim to ignore. Their empire, once stretching across half the Pacific, was shrinking. The enemy was at their doorstep, and if Saipan fell, so too would Japan's outer defense line. In desperation, the Imperial Navy gathered every remaining carrier, battleship, and cruiser they could find. From the calm waters of Tawi-Tawi anchorage in the Sulu Sea, the first mobile fleet prepared to sail the last great gamble of the rising Sunday. At the head of this mighty force stood Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a soft-spoken tactician who believed air power could still turn the tide. His fleet was a sight to behold. The veteran carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the new flagship Taiho, escorted by heavy cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. It was the most powerful carrier group Japan had ever assembled, nearly 400 aircraft strong. On paper, it was invincible, but the paper was a lie. The truth was that the Imperial Navy was running on fumes. Their pilots were young, untested, and trained in haste. Their ships, though majestic, lacked fuel and radar to match the Americans. And worst of all, the sea itself no longer belonged to them. Beneath the waves, unseen and relentless, proud Admiral Charles Lockwood's submarine Wolfpack, a wall of steel waiting to strike. One of those submarines was USS Cavalla, fresh from Midway, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler. It was her first patrol, and fate had placed her in the perfect position directly in the path of Ozawa's fleet. As Ozawa's ships steamed north from Tawi-Tawi toward the Philippine Sea, the ocean churned with the power of their passage. On the flight deck of Shokaku, sailors secured lines, fueled aircraft, and tested engines. To them, this was the beginning of their redemption, a chance to avenge the humiliation of Coral Sea and the loss of Midway. Her captain, Hiroshi Matsubara, stood on the bridge, the wind in his face, watching as the bow cut through the swells. His carrier had been through everything: torpedoed, bombed, repaired, and still she sailed. She was the pride of the fleet, the embodiment of Japan's fighting spirit. But fate had already chosen the battlefield. And it lay not in the skies above Saipan, but in the silent depths below her hull. Far to the east, Admiral Raymond Spruance of the U.S. Fifth Fleet received intercepted Japanese signals. American codebreakers had cracked the enemy's intentions. Ozawa was coming. The U.S. Navy's response was swift. Admiral Mark Mitch's task force, 58, with 15 carriers and more than 900 aircraft, turned toward the Philippines. It would become the largest carrier battle in history, and a slaughter the Japanese would never forget. As both fleets closed the distance, the vast Pacific became a trap of its own making. Ozawa believed he was luring the Americans into a decisive engagement. In truth, he was sailing straight into their guns and into the periscope of a submarine that waited with deadly patience. The Empire was gambling everything: ships, men, and honor on one final roll of the dice. And the dice were already in motion. Before dawn, on June 16, 1944, the Pacific stretched wide and empty, its calm surface hiding the deadliest ambush ever conceived. Across hundreds of miles, a dozen American submarines waited in silence, a steel barrier stretching from the Marianas to the Philippines. Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, had called it Operation Forager's Guard Line. Each boat was assigned a sector. Their mission was simple: find the enemy fleet before it could strike the American invasion force at Saipan. Among these hunters was the USS Cavalla, SS-244, a new Balao-class submarine under Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler. She was sleek, fast, and untested in combat. Her crew, young, they had trained for months, rehearsing torpedo runs and emergency dives, learning how to live in steel confinement where every mistake could mean death. Cavalla's orders were to patrol a sector near the western approaches of the Philippine Sea. Kossler studied his charts carefully, marking expected Japanese routes with pencil lines. He knew the Imperial Navy would not sail randomly It would follow predictable paths towards Saipan, driven by fuel limits and strategy. If he could find them, even one sighting could save thousands of lives. In Pearl Harbor's intelligence rooms, code breakers had intercepted enough radio traffic to sense movement. The Japanese fleet, WWII, reborn, was on the move. Admiral Lockwood radioed a simple order to his submarines. Eyes open. Report anything. Days passed in suffocating stillness. Inside Cavalla, the men worked in shifts, their world reduced to gauges, red light, and recycled air. They listened through hydrophones for the faint pulse of propellers, the heartbeat of the enemy. Sonar operators sat with headphones pressed tight, filtering out the rhythm of the sea. Biologicals, fish, whales, shrimp were ignored. They were waiting for something heavier, something alive with machinery and menace. On June 18th, Cavalla's radar picked up faint returns, multiple contacts, large and moving fast. Kossler and his officers leaned over the radar scope, the green blips bright against the darkness. It was too big to be a convoy. It had to be a fleet. That night, Kossler surfaced to confirm. The moon was thin, the sea calm. Through the periscope, faint silhouettes appeared on the horizon ships, dozens of them, in formation. He counted their masts, their wakes, their spacing. The largest shapes were unmistakable. Carriers. Kossler's heart pounded. This was it, the main Japanese force, Admiral Ozawa's first mobile fleet. Directly ahead of him, he ordered his radioman to prepare a sighting report. To send it meant risking detection. The Japanese could triangulate his signal, and destroyers would descend within hours. But duty came before safety. At 3 a.m., Cavalla broke radio silence. The message was brief, coded, and historic. Sighted large enemy task force, course east. Multiple carriers. Proceeding to attack. The transmission flashed across the Pacific to Admiral Spruance aboard Indianapolis. Within minutes, the U.S. Fifth Fleet knew exactly where to strike. Below the waves, Kossler stared into the darkness. He had just drawn a line in history, a single submarine, against the might of Japan. The wolves had found their prey, and now the hunter would close in for the kill. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, and the ocean shimmered like molten glass. Beneath it, the USS Cavalla stalked forward, engines whispering at 1/3 speed. In the control room, every man was alert, every movement deliberate. The temperature rose steadily, beads of sweat glistening on foreheads. They had found the enemy, but now came the hardest part, staying unseen long enough to strike. At the periscope, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler scanned the horizon. Through the narrow lens, he saw a sight both magnificent and deadly. The Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet stretched across the ocean like a moving city, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers sailing in perfect formation. It was one of the last grand displays of Japanese naval power. The sea around them foamed white from their wakes, the sky above filled with circling aircraft. Then Kossler saw her, the Shokaku. Sleek, formidable, her rising sun, insignia blazing red against her flight deck. She had been the pride of Japan since 1941. One of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, she had survived Coral Sea, escaped Santa Cruz, endured countless battles. She was the spirit of the empire itself. Kossler lowered the periscope, his mind racing. He knew what this meant. If he could sink her, it would be more than a victory, it would be justice. Sound bearings and range, he ordered calmly. The sonar team responded instantly, their voices tight but steady. Hydrophone operators could hear the rhythmic thrum of Shokaku's engines, a deep, powerful beat distinct from the escorts around her. The crew began plotting firing solutions, calculating course and speed with mechanical precision. Cavalla crept closer, moving through a deadly maze of escorts. Japanese destroyers prowled the edges of the Bori formation, their sonar pings echoing faintly through the steel hull. Each pulse was a reminder. If they were detected, they would die within minutes. Kossler surfaced briefly to confirm his position. Through the mist, he could see black plumes of exhaust on the horizon, the shadow of an entire fleet moving to engage the Americans at Saipan. It was the start of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but for Cavalla, the war had narrowed to one single target. At 8 a.m., he ordered a new depth and adjusted course to intercept. Cavalla was now inside the formation's outer screen, less than 2,000 yards from the enemy's destroyers. The tension was unbearable. Every man aboard moved slowly, carefully, afraid that even a dropped wrench might betray them. Kossler raised the periscope again. The Shokaku filled his sight broadside, ideal for attack. Her flight deck was busy with aircraft being armed for launch, deck crews running across her length. She had no idea that beneath her a predator watched. "Steady as she goes," Kossler whispered. In the torpedo room, men waited by their tubes, hands poised over firing triggers. 6 torpedoes were ready 6 chances to change the war. At 10:30 a.m., Kossler looked again through the periscope. The carrier was closing fast, crossing Cavalla's path. He could see the red sun markings on the wings of her planes. "Stand by," he said quietly. Every man aboard held his breath. Somewhere above, the Japanese sailors walked across Shokaku's decks, unaware that the ocean beneath them had turned into a hunter's trap. The moment was near. The hunter and the hunted shared the same silence, one final breath before history erupted. The clock in Cavalla's control room ticked toward 11 in the morning, each second pounding louder than depth charges. The submarine was deep within the Japanese formation now, surrounded on all sides by destroyers. The men moved like ghosts, silent, focused, breathing shallowly in the stifling heat. The air reeked of oil and sweat. One wrong move, one sound too sharp, and the hunter would become the hunted. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler stood by the periscope, calm but taut as a drawn wire. His face was pale under the dim red lights. "Up scope," he said quietly. The narrow beam of daylight cut through the darkness as he lifted the eyepiece. There, straight ahead, loomed the Shokaku. She was less than 2 miles away now, sailing majestically through calm seas, her flight deck alive with activity. Crews in white uniforms moved across her length, refueling and rearming aircraft for the next wave. Kossler could see her escort destroyers weaving alongside, their wakes slicing white trails through the water. He lowered the periscope and spoke softly. "That's her, the Shokaku." The name alone carried weight. It was one of the 6 carriers that had launched planes at Pearl Harbor. For the men of Cavalla, this was not just an attack, it was justice waiting beneath the surface. Kossler's voice remained even, but his orders came faster now. "Helm, come left to 095. Maintain periscope depth. Torpedo room, make ready all forward tubes." The reply was a whisper. "Aye, sir. Tubes 1 through 6 ready." Cavalla turned slowly, angling for the perfect firing position. Through the periscope, Kossler watched the target cross from port to starboard, a broadside shot, the kind every submariner dreamed of. But the closer they got, the greater the danger. At 10:55 a.m., a destroyer's sonar ping echoed through the hull, sharp, metallic, searching. Every man froze. The sound came again, closer this time. The destroyer was sweeping its sector, hunting for anything beneath the waves. Kossler clenched his jaw. "Hold depth," he whispered. No noise. For a moment, it seemed the destroyer might turn toward them. Then the pings drifted away, fading into silence. The men exhaled quietly. The trap remained intact. Kossler raised the periscope again. Shokaku was crossing 1,200 yards off their bow-perfect range. The massive ship filled his lens, sunlight flashing off her bridge windows. He could even see the red circle of the rising sun, painted on the plains, warming up for launch. She was a floating city, beautiful and doomed. The torpedo data computer hummed as bearings were updated. Set depth, 15 feet. Speed high, Kossler ordered. Spread 6 fish. Target angle, 105. Range, 1,200 yards. A pause. Then his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Fire one." The submarine jolted softly as the first torpedo left its tube, followed by the second, third, and fourth, 6 total. A fan of steel and vengeance racing toward the surface. "Down periscope," Kossler said. Cavalla turned sharply to starboard, diving deeper to avoid the counterattack she knew would follow. The crew listened, hearts pounding, as the seconds stretched. Then, faintly at first, came the sound they had been waiting for, a deep, distant crump, then another and another. 3 explosions in rapid sequence. Men looked at one another. No one spoke. Above them, the sea shuddered. The Shokaku had been struck. At 11:18 a.m., the calm of the Philippine Sea was torn apart. The USS Cavalla's 6 torpedoes had found their mark, slicing silently through the blue until they slammed into the Shokaku's starboard side. 3 detonated almost simultaneously, a deep, rolling thunder that echoed across the fleet. The shock waves rattled the submarine even hundreds of feet below. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then cheers erupted, low and restrained, filled with disbelief and awe. "Direct hits!" the sonar man shouted, voice trembling. Kossler raised his hand, and the room fell silent again. The fight wasn't over, not yet. "Take her deep," he ordered. "Rig for silent running." The ballast tanks hissed as Cavalla descended into darkness. Above them, chaos ruled. The Shokaku, once a symbol of imperial might, was engulfed in fire and panic. The first torpedo had ruptured her aviation fuel tanks, sending a geyser of flame roaring up through the hangar deck. The second tore into her engine spaces, flooding compartments and cutting power. The third ripped open her forward section, twisting steel and hurling men through the air. On her bridge, Captain Hiroshi Matsubara felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. Flames leapt skyward as columns of black smoke climbed into the morning sky. Alarm bells rang. Men shouted, hoses hissed, and sailors scrambled to fight the Inferno. But it was useless. The fuel-fed fire spread faster than water could tame it. Within minutes, the carrier's hangar was a furnace. Planes, still loaded with bombs and gasoline, exploded one after another in a chain reaction that shook her from bow to stern. Below the surface, Cavalla's crew listened. Through the hydrophones came the muffled roars of secondary explosions, each one a confirmation that their attack had struck at the heart of the enemy. But triumph quickly turned to tension. The Japanese escorts were moving. The sonar man whispered, multiple screws closing fast. Kossler didn't flinch. All ahead 1/3. Depth 200 feet. Keep her quiet. Destroyers began their counterattack. The first depth charges dropped minutes later, crashing into the sea above like hammers from the heavens. The explosions rolled through the water, slamming against Cavalla's hull. Lights flickered, gauges trembled. The air was hot and thick with diesel fumes. Some men prayed quietly. Others clenched their fists and stared at the deck, counting the seconds between detonations. Above them, the Shokaku was dying. Flames tore through her decks, ammunition cooked off in violent bursts, and thick black smoke marked her agony across the sky. Sailors fought to abandon ship, but explosions trapped many below. The mighty carrier, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, was breaking apart, undone by one silent submarine. In Cavalla's control room, Kossler listened as the sounds of the surface battle faded. There were fewer propeller noises now, fewer explosions. Then came a long, low rumble, followed by silence. The sonar operator looked up. "She's gone, Captain," he whispered. Kossler closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He knew what that silence meant. Over 1,000 men lost, a symbol of Japan's naval power erased in minutes. He looked around the cramped, sweating faces of his crew. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "that's for Pearl Harbor." No one cheered, no one spoke. The sea above them still trembled with the echoes of destruction. But below, the Cavalla drifted in reverent quiet. They had struck a killing blow and lived to tell of it. The first depth charge exploded above Cavalla like a hammer striking the ocean itself. The shock wave hit the submarine's hull with a force that rattled teeth and knocked men from their stations. The red lights flickered, dials trembled, the air filled with the groan of tortured metal. "Hold depth," Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kossler barked. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of the sea. The helmsman fought the controls, keeping the submarine level as water pressure mounted. They were down to 250 feet deeper than was safe and sinking slowly. Above them, the Japanese destroyers swarmed like angry hornets. Cavalla's attack on Shokaku had been devastating, but now every escort in the formation was hunting her. Hydrophones picked up the sharp, rhythmic pings of enemy sonar, 1, then 2, then 4 destroyers closing in. The sound grew louder with each sweep. The men could almost feel it through their bones. "All ahead 1/3. Kossler ordered softly. Silent running. The crew obeyed without hesitation. The engines slowed. The submarine slipped through the depths like a ghost, trying to disappear into the cold black silence. The first pattern of depth charges fell seconds later. A series of muffled blasts shook the hull. Dust and paint flaked from the ceiling. A wrench rolled off a bench, clanging against the floor. The sound was deafening. In the control room, sweat dripped from every face. The air was hot and thick, smelling of oil, fear, and electricity. Somewhere in the machinery compartment, a pipe hissed a whisper of leaking air that sounded far too loud. A crewman reached up instinctively and tightened the valve, his hands trembling. "Depth charges, close," the sonar man whispered. The words were barely out before another wave detonated. The submarine rocked violently. Lights went out for a second. A few men were thrown to the deck. Kossler steadied himself on the periscope handles. "Damage control, report." "No flooding, sir. Minor leaks in aft compartment." "Very well. Keep it tight. Trim her by the bow, take her to 300 feet. Cavalla slid deeper, her hull creaking under the pressure. Every groan sounded like the ocean's warning. Above, destroyers circled, dropping charge after charge, trying to crush the unseen killer. Hours passed this way. Explosions came in bursts, sometimes near, sometimes far, always sudden. Each one sent a shudder through the sub's frame. The men stopped flinching after a while. They had accepted it. The sea would decide whether they lived or died. At one point, the sonar operator looked up. "They're moving off, sir," he whispered hopefully. But moments later, the pings returned. Closer than ever. Another barrage followed. Kossler stood unmoving, eyes fixed on his instruments. "Steady," he said quietly. "We'll outlast them." Minutes stretched into hours. The Japanese destroyers finally began to drift away, their sonar fading into distance. By late afternoon, the sea above was quiet again. No pings, no explosions, just the hum of Cavalla's motors and the faint groan of metal under pressure. In that silence, the men finally breathed. Some slumped against the bulkheads, too exhausted to speak. "Surface, when it's dark," Kossler said softly. "We'll send the message then." He glanced at the clock, nearly 7 hours since they had fired their torpedoes. The Shokaku was gone, but Cavalla still lived. In the stillness of the deep, every man aboard knew what they had survived, the wrath of a dying empire. The Shokaku was burning. Above the Philippine Sea, black smoke curled thousands of feet into the air as flames devoured the once proud carrier. The ship that had launched planes over Pearl Harbor now fought for her own life. Inside her hull, chaos reigned, corridors choked with smoke, men running blindly through fire and wreckage. Explosions echoed from below decks where fuel tanks had ruptured. The scent of burning oil and cordite filled every breath. Captain Hiroshi Matsubara stood on the bridge, his face streaked with soot and sweat. His officers shouted reports, voices hoarse, but the words were barely audible over the roar of the Inferno. The ship was losing power. Water poured through the starboard compartments, and the list was growing worse by the minute. "All hands fight the fire," Matsubara commanded, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed despair. "Keep the flight deck clear. Get those bombs overboard." Sailors obeyed, some dragging hoses, others rolling fuel drums and torpedoes toward the edge, tossing them into the sea before the heat could ignite them. But the flames were too fast, too hungry. The first torpedo had ruptured the aviation gas line, running beneath the hangar, a wound that no amount of courage could seal. The fire raced along the pipes, igniting every pocket of vapor it found. The hangar became a furnace. Planes loaded with bombs began to detonate, one after another, in a thunderous chain reaction. From miles away, other ships could see the plumes rising, darkening the horizon. To them, it looked like a volcano had erupted from the sea. At 11:50 a.m., an enormous explosion tore through Shokaku's bow, ripping open her flight deck. Dozens of men were blown overboard. The shock knocked Matsubara from his feet. He pulled himself up, gripping the rail, staring at the destruction below. Fires raged unchecked from stem to stern. The carrier's once gleaming decks were blackened and twisted. Damage control teams reported flooding in multiple compartments, electrical failures, and uncontrollable fires. Matsubara knew the truth. Shokaku was finished. He turned to his executive officer. "Prepare to abandon ship," he said quietly. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Abandon ship. Abandon ship." The order spread through the decks. Men scrambled to the sides, lowering ropes and rafts. Some jumped into the sea. Others helped wounded shipmates over the railings. The ocean below boiled with oil and debris. The cries of sailors mixed with the roar of flames. At 12:10 p.m., the Shokaku's list worsened. Water rushed through her open wounds. The ship began to roll slowly to starboard. Those still aboard clung to rails and ladders, praying or shouting final words. The great carrier heeled over, her bow rising slightly as her stern slipped beneath the waves. At 3:01 p.m., a final, massive explosion erupted from within her, the last of the aviation fuel tanks detonating. The blast split her hull open, sending shockwaves across the sea. Then, with a groan that echoed like a dying breath, the Shokaku disappeared beneath the surface. More than 1,200 men went down with her. Only a few hundred survived, clinging to debris in the burning water. For the Japanese fleet, The loss was more than material, it was spiritual. The soaring crane, symbol of Japan's naval pride, had been struck down by a single submarine's silent attack. The sea closed over her remains, flames hissing out one by one. And as the smoke drifted away, all that was left was silence. The silence of an empire beginning to die. The sea was quiet again by the time the USS Cavalla rose toward periscope depth. Hours had passed since the last depth charge, but the men were still afraid to breathe too loudly. The air was thick, hot, and stale. The smell of sweat and oil clung to everything. In the control room, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler wiped his face with a rag and checked his watch. It was nearly dusk. Periscope depth, he ordered softly. The ballast tanks hissed, and the submarine crept upward through the black water. When they broke the surface layer, Kossler raised the periscope, turning slowly, scanning the horizon. Where the Shokaku had been, there was nothing now, only drifting smoke and small patches of burning oil. The sea carried debris, planks, life rafts, fragments of steel, and the floating bodies of men who had served their emperor to the end. Kossler lowered the periscope and stood in silence for a long moment. No cheers came from his crew this time. The weight of what they had done hung in the air like the pressure of the ocean itself. "Surface the boat," he said quietly. The Cavalla rose through the waves, the hatch clanging open as cool evening air poured inside. The crew clambered topside, blinking against the dim light. For the first time in nearly 12 hours, they could breathe freely. The sunset cast the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the same colors as the flag painted on the carrier they had sent to the bottom. Radioman Second Class Henry Lyons waited by the transmitter. Kossler gave a single nod. "Send it." Lyons keyed the message, each word tapping history into code. Attacked Shokaku-class carrier. 3 hits. Heavy explosions. Believe target sunk. The transmission sped through the ether, bouncing across the Pacific until it reached Pearl Harbor. Minutes later, the reply came back, short and proud. "Well done, Cavalla." Kossler read the words aloud. The crew let out a low cheer, tired but heartfelt. For months, the Japanese had ruled the Pacific skies with the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Now, one of those ghosts was gone, avenged by a single submarine's torpedoes. Yet there was no celebration in Kossler's eyes. He looked out over the sea, where waves rolled gently across the site of the sinking. Somewhere down there, more than 1,000 sailors rested. They had fought bravely for their homeland, just as his men had fought for theirs. In war, the line between victory and tragedy was as thin as the horizon before him. That night, Cavalla turned east, slipping back into the deep, heading towards safer waters. Inside, the men spoke in low voices, replaying every moment of the battle, the approach, the torpedoes, the explosions. Each man had stared death in the face and survived. Kossler stood alone in the conning tower, the wind whipping against his cap. Behind him, the stars began to appear, one by one, over the dark Pacific. Somewhere to the west, the Japanese fleet was in retreat, its power shattered. The Cavalla moved silently through the night, a shadow among waves, a hunter returning home. When dawn broke on June 20th, 1944, the smoke of the previous day still clung to the horizon. The once mighty First Mobile Fleet of Japan was now a fleet in retreat, battered, burning, and broken. The loss of the Shokaku had been devastating, but it was not the only tragedy that day. The new flagship Taiho, pride of the Imperial Navy, had also met her fate. Struck by another American submarine, the the USS Albacore, two of Japan's finest carriers gone within hours, their decks turned into funeral pyres on the open sea. For the Japanese commanders, the reality was unbearable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had begun as a desperate gamble to halt the American advance at Saipan. Instead, it had become a disaster. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had once believed air power could still turn the tide, now stood on the bridge of his remaining carrier, Shokaku, watching as smoke trailed across the water from ships that would never return. The battle raged for 2 more days, but the outcome was never in doubt. American carrier aircraft, guided by radar and precision coordination, tore through Japan's untested pilots in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 300 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day. Those who managed to take off often never came back. The Empire had run out of men to replace them, and the few who survived were haunted by skies filled with American Hellcats. Beneath the waves, Cavalla continued her patrol, her crew unaware that their victory had marked the beginning of the end for the Imperial Navy. The sinking of Shokaku and Taiho crippled Japan's carrier force beyond recovery. Without these ships, the fleet could no longer project air power or protect its transports. The Pacific, once a symbol of Japan's ambition, now belonged to the United States. At Pearl Harbor, when the message of Cavalla's success reached Admiral Charles Lockwood, the submarine commander allowed himself a rare smile. His Wolfpack had struck harder than anyone had dared hope. 2 submarines, acting alone in the vastness of the Pacific, had achieved what entire air wings could not. They had shattered the enemy's naval heart. The news spread quickly through the fleet. In every wardroom and mess hall, sailors spoke of Cavalla's torpedo spread that sent Shokaku to the bottom. Yet even in their pride, they understood what it meant. The war was turning. Japan's days of striking first were over. From now on, they would only defend, retreat, and remember. For Japan, the loss was not only military, but spiritual. The soaring crane and the great phoenix Shokaku and Taiho had represented more than ships. They were symbols of honor, resilience, and national pride. Now both rested beneath the sea, reminders that no empire could outlast the tide of history. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Navy was a shadow of itself. The few surviving carriers, including Shokaku, would meet their fate at Leyte Gulf, where Japan's final hopes would burn away completely. The sea had claimed its price, and the empire that once dreamed of ruling the Pacific had been undone by silence. The silence of a submarine's approach and the echo of torpedoes that would shape the rest of the war. When the thunder of battle faded, what remained was silence, not peace, but the kind that follows when life and death have both spent themselves. Beneath that silence, the USS Cavalla cruised slowly eastward, her hull scarred by pressure, her crew exhausted but alive. The men had fought their war in whispers and shadows, their courage measured not by shouts or medals, but by how long they could sit still while death searched for them above. In the control room, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler sat quietly, eyes on the compass, the soft hum of machinery filling the space around him. His thoughts were not of glory or triumph, but of what lay behind the burning carrier, the men who had vanished into the sea. He had seen their faces once through the periscope, small dots running across the deck as fire consumed the Shokaku. He would never forget that sight. For the crew, the hours that followed were strangely heavy. Some tried to joke, others wrote notes in their logbooks, hands shaking. One man murmured a prayer for the enemy sailors who never had a chance. They were soldiers too, born into duty, bound by orders, and swallowed by the same sea that now carried Cavalla home. War, they all knew, was not about heroes or villains. It was about endurance, who could hold their breath longer, who could act when fear made the world go still. In his tiny cabin, Kossler finally allowed himself to rest. He took out a small photograph of his wife and newborn son, both waiting back home in the quiet safety of Ohio. He looked at their faces and wondered if they could ever understand what it meant to send men to their deaths, even in the name of victory. Then he slipped the picture back into his wallet and returned to his log. His entry was simple: engaged enemy carrier. 3 torpedo hits, targets sunk. No mention of fire, no mention of screams. Just the cold facts of history. Far across the ocean, Japanese survivors drifted on debris. Some clung to planks, others floated silently face down. The lucky few were picked up by destroyers hours later. Their skin burned, eyes empty. They whispered prayers for their fallen shipmates, for the captain who went down with his ship, and for the homeland they would never see again. 2 nations, 2 crews, 1 ocean between them, each convinced their cause was just, each paying the same price in fear and sacrifice. When night came, Cavalla's men climbed topside to breathe the cool air. The stars above were endless, glittering reflections of the world they fought to protect. The war still raged in the distance in Saipan, in the skies, in hearts. But for that moment, they stood together beneath the same vast silence that had taken so many others. The sea had no sides. It held both hunter and hunted, victor and victim, in its eternal, indifferent calm. And for every ship that sank, for every man lost beneath those dark waters, it offered the same grave, quiet, deep, and unforgiving. Years passed, and the noise of war faded into memory. The USS Cavalla, once a silent predator stalking the depths, found peace at last, not in battle, but in remembrance. Today she rests at Wolfpack in Galveston, Texas, her steel hull preserved beneath the sun, her periscope still reaching toward the sky as if searching for ghosts on the horizon. Tourists walk her narrow decks now, unaware that every bolt, every dented panel, carries the echo of that day in June 1944, when the submarine sent one of Japan's greatest warships to the bottom of the sea. Inside her restored control room, time stands still. The periscope gleams, the dials are frozen mid-turn, and the silence feels almost sacred. Guides tell visitors about Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kossler, the calm captain who dared to attack a fleet, and the crew who endured hours of relentless depth charges without breaking. Their courage was not born of rage or revenge, but of quiet resolve, the kind that changes history without asking for applause. Thousands of miles away, beneath the waters of the Philippine Sea, the Shokaku lies in her eternal rest. For decades, her location was a mystery, her name spoken in reverence by those who remembered her as a symbol of Japan's naval pride. In 2015, her wreck was finally found, resting nearly 4,000 feet below the surface. Her bow still bears the faint trace of the red rising sun, her flight deck torn open by explosions, her hangar filled with the ghosts of planes that never took off. Both ships, the Hunter and the Hunted, remain where time has left them. One preserved above the surface, one entombed in silence. Together, they tell a story larger than war, the story of men bound by duty, courage, and fate. For every victory, there was loss. For every sunken ship, a memory. The Pacific holds them all, American and Japanese alike, resting side by side in the same vast graveyard of steel and dreams. In the quiet halls of museums, children press their hands to Cavalla's cold metal, listening to guides speak of bravery and sacrifice. They cannot feel the heat of that June morning, or the trembling of the hull when death thundered from above. But the story endures, whispered through time, a reminder that history is not made by nations alone, but by men who dared to face the impossible. As the sun sets over Galveston Bay, the light turns the submarine's surface to gold. The waves lap gently against her side, like the ocean remembering. Beneath another ocean, far away, the Shokaku sleeps in silence, her crew forever at watch. The hunter and the fallen are united now, not by war, but by the sea itself, vast, eternal, and forgiving. And so, their story ends where it began, in the stillness between life and death,